Okay, we are now live with Robert Jensen, a retired journalism professor from University of Texas. This is Green Philosophy. Robert, it's good to have you here.
Great to be with you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon.
So, you inspired me to go down the whole anti-capitalist rabbit hole, but I want to start this off on how how is pornography kind of a product of a capitalist society?
Well, contemporary pornography is a product of not only a capitalist society, but a patriarchal society and a white supremacist society. Pornography is an interesting issue because it's where you see those three systems of power, which define a whole lot of the power dynamics of the contemporary world. It's where you see them coming together. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, pornography in its contemporary form, and we need to distinguish pornography from the idea of talk about sex. In any culture, there's talk about sex, and that includes art, literature, all sorts of things. Sexuality is a part of human life, it's a part of human culture. But when we talk about pornography in this context, we're talking about a contemporary, mass-mediated, mass-marketed product that has really only been part of the scene in an extraordinary way in the post-World War II era in the United States. So that when we talk about pornography, that's what I mean by that. Well, pornography is really a way of delivering objectified female bodies to men for sexual pleasure. It's not the only way that that happens. Prostitution, stripping, all sorts of ways that in a patriarchal culture, objectified female bodies are delivered to men for pleasure. Pornography is one form of that. It's patriarchal in its basic intent. That is what porn is. Now, there's lots of different kinds of pornography. There's gay porn, there's lesbian porn. But at the core, the vast majority of what we call pornography is that delivering women's bodies to men. All right, that's patriarchal. It's also white supremacist. If you look at the content of contemporary pornography, you'll notice incredibly racist themes that run throughout it. Not surprising that in a genre, pornography, that sexualizes inequality, primarily the inequality that women experience at the hands of men. When pornography sexualizes male power and the resulting inequality, it's going to look to sexualize other kinds of inequality, and one of those in this society is, of course, race. Now, you started with capitalism, and of course, in an economic system that has no calculus for value beyond the ability to generate profit. It's not surprising we see pornography because, of course, it generates extraordinary profits. I'm not saying that this kind of material wouldn't exist in some other economic system, but it's clearly driven by that amoral profit motive that comes in capitalism. In some sense, to quote a friend who came up with this designation, I always wish I'd thought of this, but it was Matt Ezell, great young scholar. He said, you can think of porn as the sort of perfect storm of inequality. It's a place where you see those three great systems of hierarchy, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism coming together.
So I actually quit my porn habit, and the one thing I want all my viewers to know is that porn should probably be classified as a drug because life after porn, the colors that I see are brighter, the sounds that I hear, the smells that I smell, just basically the level of sensory perception and depth has increased so much since going off of it. And I do know there's one particular TED Talk, it was entitled Porn, the New Tobacco. So what are your thoughts on porn as a drug?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for saying that out loud. It's hard for men often to, first of all, acknowledge that they have an addictive-like use of porn. And it's important that we talk out loud about it. I've written about, for instance, how I, as a young man and a boy, was a porn user up until the point I discovered the feminist critique of pornography. Now, of course, I'm 61 years old. My experience with pornography in a pre-internet world It's extraordinarily different. And I think young men struggle even more, as you're pointing out. So there's a lot of debate about whether it's right to call a habitual use of pornography that has negative consequences, and I'll talk about for men, although women can experience this as well. There's debate about whether we should call that an addiction, whether we should analogize pornography to a drug. I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a psychologist, I don't want to really get bogged down in an argument, but I can say, just as you're testifying, that there are lots and lots of men who, when they describe their use of pornography, describe something that is addictive-like. It's a habitual use that they may wish to quit but can't quit. They find themselves saying, I don't want to do this, but are drawn back into it. And as you're pointing out also, there are effects in their ability to be sexual, be intimate with people in real life. It seems to me that if you look at all of this, it makes perfect sense to talk about pornography addiction. But again, there will be people who debate that. But whatever term we use, we see that pornography has negative consequences for the men who use it. And that's one of the things the feminist movement talks about, the consequences for the users, as well as the negative consequences for women who are used in the production of pornography, for women who are perhaps targeted by men who use pornography, for women who are in relationships with men who use pornography. There are harms across the board for anybody really involved in the production and use of pornography. And we have to start talking openly about it, as you just did, and I think that's really important.
So, one of your topics is anti-capitalism in 5 minutes. You know, the things that you would bring up to coworkers around the water cooler.
Yeah.
So what if you had some buddies at work and you wanted to give them an introduction to why you oppose capitalism? What kinds of talking points would you make?
Right. I wrote that piece because often people who come out of a left perspective get bogged down in Marxist terminology or a kind of ideological zeal, which I'm not making fun of, but it's often an impediment to connecting with ordinary people who haven't read the same Marxist books you've read, maybe. And so this capitalism, anti-capitalism in 5 minutes or less, was just a way to think about how one can immediately identify the negative consequences of capitalism. There are positive consequences to capitalism, I suppose, if you think about the incredible explosion of production and consumer goods and all that. I'm not even sure all of that is all good, but there are negative aspects. One is that capitalism is anti-democratic. Capitalism concentrates wealth. That's the way the system works. And if you concentrate wealth, you're going to concentrate political power because people with that wealth have an extraordinary amount of influence over the political system. So if we believe in democracy, then we have to see capitalism as a problem. I often say capitalism is inhumane. That is, if we have moral principles about how to treat other people, about the inherent dignity and worth of all people, well, capitalism is an impediment to that as well, because capitalism treats people not as people in that sense, but simply as producers, consumers, cogs in a machine. And you can see how the incredible inequality that results from capitalism keeps us from actually acting on our own moral principles around the dignity of all people. And finally, capitalism is unsustainable, and today this is even more important than ever. The ecological crises we face, most notably climate change and global warming, but that's not the only ecological crisis. There's chemical contamination of land and water, there's soil erosion and degradation, there's the biodiversity crisis, species extinction. All of that is tied to an obsession with growth and production, not production for need, not thinking what do people really need, but production for profit. Well, capitalism is not the only unsustainable economic system. It's not the only ecologically destructive economic system we've ever seen, but it's the one we're dealing with now, and it is the worst of them. So what I would just say is capitalism is anti-democratic, it's inhumane, and it's unsustainable. And when you put it in those terms, then people who may not be all that interested in the fine points of political philosophy can say, oh, maybe I should think about that.
So I want to come back to proposing some alternative arrangements for society. So a lot of people, I'm 30 years old. I look back on my college days. I was at Portland State out in Oregon,
Hmm.
and it was a very, if you describe it in the political terms that maybe only a small milieu will know, it's communitarianism in the sense of you live in a dorm, your friends are there, your girlfriend or your lover is probably there. Um, some of the people that you participate in clubs with, maybe they live in your building or nearby buildings, and overall, you have a lot of quality time with other people, whether it's partying, whether it's discussing politics, whether it's romance, whether it's watching movies, whether it's playing games. And I look and I think, oh my gosh, you can't ever recreate college life in the working world.
Yeah.
It's a huge challenge just to get friends to come camping with you, or get you could, if you want to do coffee, you might have to plan it out 2 weeks in advance. Whereas in college, you have so much free time and you can just spend time with all the people in your life that you love. Pretty much, it's very spontaneous. You drop by, have a cup of tea, have a cup of coffee, have a beer, and I think this could be a practical way of explaining what an alternative social arrangement might look like. Of if people don't have if people didn't have the 9 to 5 to pay
Sure.
the mortgage, pay the car, pay for medical care, pay for groceries, pay for gas, pay for phone bill, pay for cable, pay for internet. If people didn't have the necessity of a nine to
Yeah.
five, I think people would spend their time in a very different way.
Yeah, I think college is both a great example and a limited one. It's a great example because, as you're pointing out, it's a time when we're focusing on developing people's capacities. That's what education is. And we organize it. There's lots of problems. I spent 26 years teaching in a big university and I know the problems. But there is a kind of joyful participation in a collective life that you're talking about. On the other hand, of course, not everybody goes to college. And a lot of people think of college as kind of detached from the real world. But I think your point is really important, that the way we organize day-to-day life in, let's call it the dominant culture, people who work in the economy in a pretty much regular job, that the way life is organized, both in our work life and our communities, the way we organize houses and apartments and interaction, it's extremely isolating. It fragments us. It both fragments us as individuals. It splits us up and it splits us from other people. And that's no way to run a society. Often I think people, if they step back and they look at how our society is organized, it's stunning how inhuman it is. We've organized a world that isn't based on people's needs. It came from other forces, mainly forces, as you've been pointing out, for profit. Okay. So communitarianism is a term out of philosophy that says instead